Foundation. We're all in this together.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Matthew Bishop. I'm New York Bureau Chief of The Economist and author of a book called Philanthropia, which really is about the partnerships that are going on in philanthropy and with government and business nowadays. And President Clinton, I think, was one of the first world leaders to really see the importance of partnership, which has now become the buzzword that we all talk about and the process that everyone here is engaged in. And the purpose of this panel is to look at how these partnerships can be made as effective as possible, and how as a society, how as a world, we can all take the big bets, the stretch bets, the right amount of risk that really pushes us to achieve the maximum potential for this partnership movement. And we have a great panel to discuss these questions with. To my immediate left, your right, is, of course, Bill Gates, who has brought this private sector big bet risk-taking to the world of philanthropy in a way that no one else has or can. To his left is Geeta Rao-Gupta, who is Assistant Secretary of UNICEF, and to the far end is Tony Alumelu, who is a leading African philanthropist and investor. And I wanted to start, Bill, by building on a discussion we were having backstage. The world at the moment is having this discussion in New York about what follows the Millennium Development Goals. And you know, the question I wanted to explore with you was, how do we set targets that are big bets, that are achievable bets, but are stretch bets? How should we as a community think about that so that we get the right degree of challenge and the right degree of achievability, but that it's not too easy and but also it's not impossibly difficult? Oh, you need a mic.
The Millennium Development Goals are a phenomenal thing. They're the 8 priorities that were adopted by the General Assembly as sort of a report card for the world. And they're very focused on inequity in health, education, economics. And it's quite amazing that several of them will be fully achieved, even though they were set quite ambitiously. The Economist had a cover article on how the poverty goal was achieved, and in fact, that in the next round, we could get to extremely low levels of poverty. In the health area, we had 12 million children a year dying every year. On the starting point, 1990, we're now down to 6.6 million, so we'll be, by the end, close to 50% reduction. So anyway, these goals have been wonderful because they allow us to look at the countries who are doing it best, go in, talk to the leaders of the countries who aren't, and make it a priority. And so I think the world has come around that you really need some amazing partnerships to make these things happen. Now, for child mortality, you have to break it down and say, okay, there's malaria. What can the drug companies do? What can UNICEF, WHO do? What can the local governments do? There's diarrhea, there's pneumonia, there's the first 30 days. And so it's become really quite concrete. And even philanthropy, which is, as a percentage of the dollars here compared to, say, private sector, rich world donations, local government is fairly small, it can get involved in some of the riskier things. For example, the actual vaccine development piece, it is the major player in that part of it. And so it's amazing to see how that's come together.
But as you think about the next set of goals, I mean, how much stretch should we be putting in? How specific do we need to be? How far do we want to try and jump?
Well, the inequity today, say that a child under 5 has 30 times as much chance of dying as a child in a middle-income country. We have a chance in this next 15 years to largely eliminate inequity. We won't get it to 0. There will still be a differential there, but a very dramatic change. And so the fact that these are unfinished goals, and that if we keep them as unique as they've been, keep up these partnerships, we will be largely complete by 2030. To me, that says that they should be the centerpiece of what gets adopted as the world's next report card. Now, because the MDGs have been successful, every cause in the world would like to have an MDG, and that's understandable. But in terms of measurability and prioritization, there's going to be a real choice here that has to get made.
So, Gita, can I bring you in on that theme as well? I mean, what do you think the choices are that we should be making to make sure that these next set of goals, really are the right ones, and that we can channel our resources and risk-taking in the right way?
Well, I agree with Bill that that the inequities we should continue to reduce. I think the goals that we haven't yet met should remain in the next set of goals. And for the ones that we have met, we should set new targets. So I think that the 8 goals that we currently have pretty much cover what the world needs to get done. Some of those are first-generation issues that we should have dealt with a long time ago, like child mortality. And we have a ways to go with that, ending preventable child deaths. So I'm hopeful that the next set of goals will keep the same issues, but be a little more ambitious looking forward. Because I think over the past 15 years, we've learned a lot about what we can do, and there have been new innovations and new technologies developed, new ways of working together that I think can allow us to be a little more ambitious this time around.
Now, Tony, from an African perspective, what are the big bets that you would like to see the world making in terms of developing Africa?
I grew up in Africa. I was educated in Africa. I work in Africa, and my philanthropy is focused across Africa. What I have realized in my career, in my living in Africa, is that the private sector has a key role to play in helping to actually move the needle in a sustainable form in Africa. And as we talk about next phase, what I consider important will be those things, in our view, that can help create a much more competitive African environment, realizing that if the private sector does well in Africa, then it will help to a large extent in solving mankind's problems. If you take power, as I was discussing with Biz not too long ago, for instance, there's a limit to how much, in terms of concrete impact, we all can make in Africa if we didn't fix power. So I think, in talking about partnership and way forward, we should all begin to think of those catalytic and mission-critical initiatives and approaches that will help us create sustainability. Thank you.
Can I just add that there are, however, issues that were left out of the last goals that we have learned a lot about in recent years, or they have emerged as issues that need attention. One of them is violence against girls and women, for example. Another one is early childhood development and the investments that can be made then that have lasting impact. So there are some new issues, and I'm hopeful that some of the conversations will allow goals to be crafted around those kinds of issues as well.
Now, Bill, as you think about how you put your and Warren Buffett's money to work, tell us a bit about how you think about risk and return. Where do you think how do you decide where you put your money to get the maximum bang for the buck?
Well, obviously, you don't want to go into an area that's already well covered. And because philanthropy is small, even compared to aid budgets, you have to pick something that is probably risky and therefore not likely to be taken up by aid budgets. Inventing new vaccines, governments other than the US really don't get into that upstream R&D. And that's a global public good. As Africa develops, it's not going to get organized to finance a malaria vaccine for itself anytime soon. So, you know, it's very complementary. I totally agree the private sector growing, we need those roads, we need that electricity in a big way. But to go with that, you know, about 5 or 6 magical new vaccines are needed. And so that's a great place to specialize. Now that's very risky. You're going to have a lot of different oars in the water to have a high probability, say, in the next decade of succeeding in that. And you're going to need partnerships. You're going to have to work with universities, with NIH, and particularly with the pharmaceutical companies, where there's a lot of expertise about trialing and manufacturing that only exists with them. And so crafting exactly how you work with them is important. We do a report card called the Access to Medicines Index that rates all the pharma companies according to how much they do for poor people. And it's been great because every year the bar has gone up. The ones at the top want to do more, stay at the top. The ones at the bottom definitely see that, and their employees see that, and so they pushed forward on it. You know, some things are very risky. Take polio eradication. It can only work if every country in the world manages to get those polio drops out to over 90% of the kids. And so now we're down to northern Nigeria, northern Pakistan, a big outbreak in Somalia recently, where getting access to those kids is very tough because the rumors about these people are from the West, they're from the US. The US uses vaccination campaigns for bad things. You know, that has really overwhelmed the kind of trust and knowledge that you want to allow those vaccines to come in. And we could fail. You know, we raised a little over $4 billion in a summit earlier this year, and everybody endorsed the plan that runs till 2018. But you know, it's the kind of thing that the world should take on, because if you succeed, it is so incredible. It will save several billion a year, and it'll energize global health. But it's not an easy thing. It's not like building the wing of a museum where it probably will get done. This one, it should get done.
I mean, some people would say, you know, there are so many things you could be spending your money on. We've basically got rid of most polio deaths. Is it really worth all that extra effort for that one last few steps that will mean complete eradication? Shouldn't we be putting the money somewhere else?
Yeah, that's sort of a math test. The only reason we have so few cases right now is because we're spending so much money. If you stop spending the money before you get to zero, then it goes back and hundreds of thousands of kids are killed and paralyzed every year. If you wait and stop spending that money after you get to zero, then it's kind of nice. Then you take that money against pneumonia, diarrhea, neonatal, whatever those other causes are. And so you really have to judge, can it be done? Because the whole credibility of the global health endeavor is now very much tied up in this, which, you know, will Boko Haram and Borno State allow in some of these local government areas, will they allow access to those kids? That's what this thing rests on. And, you know, there are days where, you know, I worry we won't get it, but overall, I'm quite optimistic.
And you mentioned the F word of failure. Some people say, as they look at the business sector and they compare it with the philanthropic sector, that in business, you take failure occasionally as a badge of honor because you tried something, it didn't work, you learn from it and so forth. Whereas in the philanthropic world, it really is a swear word. People don't talk about it. There is a sense that people don't maybe take enough risk. How do you feel about that? Is that a fair critique?
Well, people don't take enough risk. That's fair. And they try and probably do too many things, because if you want to take a big risk, you have to really be able to develop deep technocratic understanding of the science, the tools, the social science factors that weigh into the delivery. Philanthropy should be taking much bigger risks than business. If these are easy problems, business and government can come in and solve them. So, you know, probably the most risky thing our foundation does is the money we spend in the United States, where our top priority is changing the teacher personnel system in K through 12 education so teachers get feedback. So we learn from the teachers, do it extremely well, have a professional development system, so you really understand how you could do things better, and we get the average teacher to be in the top quartile. That, because it's subject to all sorts of school board, loving the status quo, controversies over how you do these things, and are things really well known, that has a very high chance of failure. I won't give you a number. Whereas our malaria work, it's just a question of when. And I'll be disappointed if it takes too long, but malaria deaths will come down. We will discover drugs, vaccines, we'll get more bed nets out. Malaria is just impatience and cleverness. There is no mode of total and utter failure in that path, whereas on the K through 12, all the money we spend on that could end up being wasted.
Gita, we've seen this proliferation of multilateral approaches through partnerships and so forth, and UNICEF's obviously involved in a lot of those. What are you seeing about what needs to be done to make those work well?
Well, first, just to reflect on the number of what we call global program partnerships that currently exist. These are partnerships, in the past it used to be intergovernmental partnerships mostly, donor country with a program country. But increasingly over time, the need for tripartite, cooperation was thought to be necessary, including the private sector, civil society, and government. In 1989, there were 10 global program partnerships on specific issues. There are currently 180 global program partnerships, and UNICEF participates in some way in about 80 of them. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude. And the reason there's such a proliferation of them is because they do serve a purpose. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I think having all of the partners around the table, when it works well, it works incredibly well. And the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization is one example. The Global Partnership for Education is another one. Sanitation and Water for All is a third. That there are some global problems that can be resolved when we put our minds together and work together to get the job done, together with country governments who have a seat at the table in these global program partnerships. So I think that moving forward, it is going to be a mechanism that we should be using more effectively, but just increasing the number of them doesn't solve the problem. We have to figure out how to make them more effective. And that's
have you learned anything yet about what really makes the best work well?
Well, I think that each of them has taught us some lessons. It's clear that we need to have good governance structures that allow each of the partners around the table to participate in decision-making, to be involved in the implementation so that there's a shared accountability. You need to have a joint metric system so that we all know where we're headed with clear targets and goals. And in the places like in Gavi, where that's done very clearly, it works incredibly well. There are more children immunized today than before Gavi was created, primarily because of that. We've been able to sort of shape markets and reduce prices of vaccines because of Gavi. So there's a lot that can be done when it goes well.
Now, Tony, one of the big ideas at the moment is impact investing, which I think has been a theme for the last few Clinton Global Initiatives. And this is something that you very much focus on in your investing. What are you learning about how to achieve both financial returns and social environmental returns? And where do you see the big opportunity?
So at the Tony Elumelu Foundation, we do three main things. First is we support entrepreneurship. Two is we're involved in policies. And third one is access to finance. Now, we are interested in entrepreneurship because in my life growing up, as I said before, I've come to realize the power of entrepreneurship in actually helping to deal with the issue of poverty. And I've realized further that entrepreneurs cannot do well in a society or a continent where the enabling environment is not good to support business. If the enabling environment is good, the entrepreneurs will do well. As they do well, the economy will do well, and the economy will help in a significant way to address and touch lives. And also, for entrepreneurs to do well, they need access to finance, but in a creative form, in a manner that helps to address, one, economic prosperity, but equally important, addressing society's challenges. We set out in a very ambitious form to touch 10 million lives in 10 years across Africa. And we said, how do we achieve this in a manner that is truly transformative, strategic, and within the time frame that we've set? So we said, let us see how can assist the entrepreneurs, because as you see in developed economies, SMEs to a large extent drive the economies. Africa is where maybe the developed world it was so many decades ago. So indeed, actually, in developing or prescribing approaches to dealing with African issues, to a large extent, a local understanding of the issue is very, very important, what is more and what is significant. So we felt that access to finance can help. And one of the things we've done in recent times is in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. We set up, in conjunction with them, what we call the Impact Economy Fund, basically to assist people who are innovative, not necessarily because people have funds to put into impact investing across Africa, but the complaint is usually they can't find good projects. So we felt that the most significant thing to do is to help companies, institutions that would help the SMEs and entrepreneurs that are upcoming to prepare them to be at the state where people would like to invest in them. And we think that such engagements will help in a very significant way to touch lives. We also think, as I said before, that if you take power, for instance, if you take transportation, look at agricultural produce in Africa. Over 60% of agricultural produce in Africa is lost, is perished, because of access to transportation to where it is needed. If you look at power, even a lot, all sectors, as Bill and I discussed before and agreed, there's a limit to what can be achieved because of lack of power. So we think that if we must touch 10 million lives in 10 years, let's begin to focus on those catalytic and big things that can help significantly to change lives.
Do you want to build on that, Bill?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're doing, but I do think Nigeria is an interesting case where you can get economic development that's going fairly well, and yet your human indicators, childhood death, particularly in the north, because certain basic systems there aren't run very well, you're not making progress. And so, we see health statistics in the neighboring countries that are way, way poorer, that are slightly better than the north. So the two can get out of sync.
I think Bill is totally right. It is not either. It's the genius of and. We need both to work together. In fact, the concept of African capitalism that we propounded speaks to that. We feel that there's a space where business and philanthropy come together. And that space is what we should spend time to make sure we work together to achieve common good for a majority of our people.
Now, Bill, so Gita, come in.
No, I was just going to say that there is, though, also the insecurity in those regions where, yes, the infrastructure is poor, but some of those, human indicators being where they are at is also because of a political insecurity.
Well, before Boko Haram came along, the north was horrific.
Anyway,
now they've made it slightly worse.
Now, Bill, I mean, throughout your philanthropy, you've been partnering with businesses, and yesterday you had the fund you announced with JP Morgan on health innovation. Do you feel that businesses are starting to escape from this sort of Milton Friedman view of a very narrow view of their role to one that is more willing to engage in some of these big bets to improve the world?
Well, the private sector is the biggest force in terms of dollars, in terms of innovation, and often that takes a form of trickle down where, say, a medicine will be invented for rich customers, and then it's made available over time as the patent expires, the manufacturing gets more efficient. That's done an amazing amount of good. Unfortunately, that model doesn't work for everything because rich people don't get malaria. One truly ironic thing was a drug was developed for rich rural dogs, because these dogs had a real problem. They had worms. And people wanted to pay to get rid of their dogs' worms. And so it was a great market. Ivermectin was created for that. And then somebody said, well, let's try it on humans in Africa. They've got worms too. In fact, it worked very well. And the companies were extremely generous in donating all of that. But that's a strange form of trickle down from rich dogs to poor people. A lot of things we can't do it that way. I will say that in terms of these partnerships, it's sometimes interesting that the nonprofit thinks the for-profit guys are evil. There's a thing about exclusive breastfeeding and, did some companies over-promote? What's that code look like? And that's blocked cooperation between some of the food companies and some of the nonprofit actors in that stage. We need to, figure out how to get that code to be right and get the right cooperation there. Same with the drug companies. The fact that there's anything paid by Gavi to the drug companies to buy these things. There are some NGOs that came out and said, oh, that's evil. They shouldn't even get their COGS pricing. Or maybe their COGS are lower than you think they are, and you're being suckered into this. We ought to just let the children die. So I disagree with it. But bridging the gap between the way the private sector thinks about things and what's reasonable to ask them to do, and the nonprofit people who know how to deliver this stuff and really are devoting their lives to it, trying to get the best of both worlds out of that often takes a middleman sort of listening to both points.
I feel Gita wants to come in and say business is evil.
Just to say that I think that the global program partnerships that we talked about a minute ago are precisely intended to do that. They put everybody around the table together so that we can learn from each other.
Do you feel a common language is now emerging and a common understanding?
I think that we're finding some common ground, and where the nonprofits want to insist on a certain standard. I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it holds companies accountable too. But there's a lot that the private sector offers, and we have to find a way to talk and work together.
What do you think the private sector business world could do better in these partnerships?
Well, I think that the exchange of views has helped. I mean, Bill brought up specifically breastfeeding, and which is a issue that UNICEF has held a very strong view on, because it's true from all of the medical data available that when women breastfeed exclusively for the first 6 months, there are very positive health impacts for their children and for the mothers. And there's no getting away from that. It's the truth. The data proves it. So the question is, for companies that advertise and encourage women to use substitutes for breast milk in those first 6 months, that's something that I think UNICEF and other nonprofits should protest. I think that conversation is a very useful conversation to have.
Yeah, that's one that's still being worked on. We don't have the ideal. The private sector the code needs to be slightly better and clearer. But I think there's a huge opportunity there. I think people are starting to talk on that one. I think, maybe the most classic one is one that Clinton Foundation drove, which was we went from, suing South African government for off-patent use to now getting all the poor countries get their AIDS drugs at the lowest priceable price, and there's no intellectual property involved in that at all. That model has been very successful, and now there's quite a few partnerships looking to extend that out to reproductive health supplies. And often you have to make huge volume commitments to get these things into the right mode. Malaria drugs, and every one of these that gets done is kind of catalytic of people looking at, okay, where else could that be applied? The tiered pricing model is a key part of this. Deciding who's in what tier, like what tier India belongs in. Do they belong in 2 tiers? If so, how do you do channel differentiation? It's not trivial, but it's quite valuable.
Now, another big topic in this area, which you've taken one side on, is the need to measure things and measure our progress very carefully. How far do you think that can be taken? Can it be taken too far, as some critics have suggested?
Well, you certainly need to do things that are hard to measure. But some things you really can measure, your success on drug development projects, infant mortality, maternal mortality. We're trying to measure more the effects of kids who survive childhood but are damaged by malnutrition. And there's a danger that if we don't get so we can measure that, we may not understand the right interventions, and we may not focus on that area enough. There's a huge hidden cost from health that goes beyond death. And you know, it's partly when they do, and this is a very controversial area, they do IQ studies in Africa, the numbers are unbelievably low because you have kids who through malnutrition, cerebral malaria, birth asphyxia, never were able to fully develop mentally. So, you know, we shouldn't, because we're not good at measuring it yet, doesn't mean we shouldn't go into that area. So in parallel, we're working on, the Canadians have a thing called Saving Child's Minds, that tries to focus in the area that we're partnering with them on. So anything you can measure, that's great, and the MDGs are, I think, the prime example.
And Tony, do you try and measure the social and environmental impact of the investing you're doing, or is this more an act of faith that by creating jobs you're basically making the world a better place?
No, we think what gets measured gets done. And so we believe in the concept philosophy of measurement for every intervention that we do. If we want to train, we have a vocational training development center that we just set up. At the end of 5 years, we need to assess in concrete and specific terms, one, how it has helped to support the growth of the private sector and businesses in Africa. In addition to that, more importantly, training people to become more employable. Because at times, the issue with unemployment is not because companies don't want to hire, but it's because you want to hire the right human capital. In the area of education, management education, we also try to measure the kind of intervention and impact we have as it relates to supporting entrepreneurs. So we believe significantly at our foundation that measurement is key in actually getting things done. But I want to add something about the kind of partnership, go back to this, that we need in Africa. We would like to see a tripartite partnership, a partnership between development partners, partnership with the African government, and partnership with the private sector who have a role to play in this. I think that if the three parties work together, we might be able to achieve a lot more on the continent.
Can I just add that, I agree with Tony entirely that what gets measured gets done. And we have sometimes used the wrong metrics and patted ourselves on the back for having achieved success and then discovered it was the wrong indicator. And the classic example of that is using enrollment statistics for education. And we did a great job in getting more kids into school, so we thought the job was done. In fact, many kids dropped out, they didn't complete school, and certainly if you now look at the metrics for learning and try and assess whether children can read or write by 4th or 5th grade, you're finding many kids cannot. So I think one of the lessons from the last set of MDGs is picking the right indicators this time around so that we're measuring results in terms of impacts for children and families and communities rather than indicators that we can just count, find easier to count, and therefore use.
Yeah, both education and sanitation had that problem, should be fixed. The health things were a little better.
You mentioned sanitation, and one of the themes of this session is innovation. And you have, it's lunchtime, but we should talk about it. I mean, you've decided to innovate the toilet, which, I mean, most of us had thought was a pretty settled technology. Why have you done that? How's it going? And are there other similar areas that this audience could be getting involved in bringing some innovation to?
It's a great lunchtime conversation.
Well, it's a fantastic example of where trickle-down doesn't work. The Rich World toilets are built kind of on a Rube Goldberg scheme, where you bring all sorts of clean water in, you make it dirty, you send it back to a very complex plant that cleans it up. Just the piping system alone, if you were going to do, say, the slums of India, you could never afford it. And so what we need is something whose smell and disease prevention characteristics are as good as the gold standard, which is the flush toilet, but don't require that completely unaffordable infrastructure. And so you have to get the best people in smell, the best people in taking the disease causing the pathogenesis of the waste and get rid of it. And so we had a big contest. Caltech won the first prize. We had 4 prizes. Now we're working on what does the engineering for that look like. It's easier at a community level to create a low-cost toilet, and that's a huge contribution. You want it, though, in the individual household so that women don't have to go out at night, so there's no insecurity or harassment type problem there. And I think we'll be able to do it, but there was not enough of a market. It would not have happened without philanthropy coming in. And the scientists were going to say, oh, you know, we know how to do smell. Nobody ever asked us how to solve this problem. So it's taking high IQ scientists who weren't thinking much about toilets in advance, thought that it was a solved problem, and drawing them into the partnership.
Do you think there's a bunch of other areas where maybe people in this audience could take the initiative in driving some innovation?
Oh, sure. It's pretty cool now. A lot of universities have programs to come up with tools for poor countries and trying to raise the awareness of that. You've got crowdsourcing, where somebody will put out something. You know, there was one where you actually power a light by you lift up a weight. It's almost like an old clock type system, and actually given the power consumption of LED light, that got fully funded like in 10 days. So there's a lot of neat tools out there. The JP Morgan thing was $100 million to go to late stage drugs that could work both in poor and middle income markets. Funding innovation, a lot of you out there, picking what you're passionate about and thinking, what are the innovative tools? Are you willing to wait 5 to 10 years? Are you willing to go out and figure out which university has the science that connects to that area? It's often something government will not do well, even in areas like education or even rich world health. They often miss some of these opportunities.
I just wanted to add that UNICEF has, in fact, invested a lot in innovation. And our executive director, Anthony Lake, has actually set up an innovation unit in his executive office just to inform his thinking on the topic. And there's a lot that can be done. I mean, the SMS technology alone can help with making sure that field workers at the community level get the information they need to report back on the information that they're gathering. In fact, in Nigeria, the rapid SMS platform is allowing field workers to report on births at a very large scale across the country. So there's another really interesting innovation that our team in Uganda came up with, which is called U-Report, where you get young people across the country to use SMS technology to answer a question based on either the information they gather within their community or what they know. And it all comes back into a massive data bank that then gets sorted to identify where our programming hasn't worked because the information hasn't gotten there, or where there seems to be misinformation.
I want to give the last word to you, Tony. I mean, where are you seeing the most exciting African entrepreneurs at the moment?
First, I'd like to say something as it relates to this conversation. Africa, where Africa is at today should be understood in the context of all of these discussions. And again, a deep understanding of, of the needs of Africa in terms of priority, in terms of ranking is equally important. The basic thing we are taught in economics is that human wants are insatiable, but the resources to meet these wants are scarce, and therefore we are forced to prioritize a scale of preference. If we apply that here, there's so much, Africa needs a lot, but let's look at the most significant things that will touch the most lives, realizing that the resources are not so much. So this therefore lends credence and urgency and need to a deep engagement, interaction with people on ground and people who are interested in supporting the continent, so that there is a sync of what is most important at this point in time. Thank you.
Great. Well, Tony, Gita, and Bill, thank you very much for a very stimulating and inspiring conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.